Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Noel Heikkinen, and I'm one of the pastors at Riverview Church in the Lansing, Michigan area. And to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure why I'm here today. I couldn't help but suspect a clerical error in my invitation, and yet I'm going to take this opportunity because I have 9 minutes of time, oddly, today, and I, at the same time, have something I'm very passionate about that I'd love to share with you. And so thanks to Leadership Network for giving me this opportunity. I want to start by telling you the story of a little boy who wandered in the woods one day and found the cocoon for an emperor moth. It was hanging on this tiny twig. And so he carried this twig home and carefully placed it in a mason jar so he could watch and see what happened with this cocoon. After a few days, he noticed that there was a tiny little hole on the bottom of the cocoon. So he sat down to watch and see what would happen. But for hours, he watched as this moth attempted to struggle his way through that tiny little hole. It seemed at times that he would get stuck, that he could go no further, that he had been working as hard as he could, and there just was no more movement to be had. And the little boy was concerned about the health of that emperor moth, and so he did the only thing he could think of. He found a sharp pair of scissors and he cut a little bit of a hole on the side to allow the moth to have an easier time coming out of the cocoon, and it did. It easily emerged from the cocoon, but something was wrong. Its body was swollen and misshapen. Its wings were tiny and shriveled. And so the little boy waited, looking for that moment when the wings were just going to pop open and the body would take shape. But it never happened in the life of that moth. In fact, that moth ended up walking the rest of its life, and it never grew the ability to fly. See, what had happened is that well-intentioned but ill-informed young man was he subverted a crucial step in the health of an emperor moth. What he did is he got rid of that tiny little hole. And that tiny little hole is God's sovereign plan for the emperor moth. It allows the fluid from the bloated body of this moth to be pressed out into the wings so that this moth can learn to fly. You deprive the moth of the struggle, you deprive the moth of the tiny little hole, and you deprive the moth of its health, and you sabotage the future of that moth. What breaks my heart is that I see churches doing the very same thing today. Well-intentioned but ill-informed churches are taking away a crucial component to the health of their churches, the tiny little hole that God has set up. See, God set up this tiny little hole. It's God's plan for the church. And what it does is it forces the fluid from our bloated egos to be pressed out of us and into the churches so that our churches can fly. And the ability to fly for these churches is crucially tied to this struggle. And you deprive the church of this struggle. If you deprive the church of this tiny little hole, then you deprive the church of its health. And you sabotage the future of that church. What is that tiny hole? That tiny hole is a team of qualified elders leading the church together. Even a cursory view through the New Testament will show you that there is a single form of local church leadership in the churches, and that is the elders. It's picked up various names over time, pastors and overseers and shepherds. We see this even in Acts 20. Paul goes and he meets with the Ephesians. What does he do? Does he call up the senior pastor of the church and say, hey, senior pastor, I need to meet with you? No, he calls the elders. There's an S on the end. The elders of the church together. And he says this. He says, when we landed in Miletus, he sent a message to the elders of the church at Ephesus, asking them to come and meet with him. And throughout Acts 20, as he's referring to these elders, he calls them shepherds. He calls them overseers. He calls them elders. These are all appropriate terms. In our culture, we tend to use the term pastor because it's more widely known. But I wonder if that term pastor has begun to cause problems. In our church, even, we refer to the pastors. But I kind of wish we used elders because pastoring is one of the things that the elders do. But elders are the single form of leadership that God has set up for his church. Even a cursory view of Paul's writings on leadership, of Peter's writings on leadership, will show that there are always a team of elders together leading the church. In fact, you can even go back further, and you can get back to Jesus sending out his disciples 2 by 2. He's sending these people out. When Jesus sent out the 72, he's sending them out 2 by 2. There was always a team. In fact, the only place where you don't find the team in the Bible is where in the Old Testament, where the people whined and complained, and in God's own words, rejected him, and he said, fine, you guys can have a king. That was the one time we don't have a team. In the New Testament, every single local church either has a team of elders or is told to get a team of elders. Now, many people hear that and they say, sure, we have elders, we have a team. What I'm not referring to here is a board that keeps the pastor in line, or some sort of system of check and balances. When I'm talking about a team of qualified elders, I am talking about men who are in the trenches doing the ministry. I know of so many churches that spend years upon years searching for a senior pastor, and then they spend weeks selecting elders who they then place in charge of that pastor. The burden of proof is really on those who set up a system like that. The burden of proof is not on those that have a team of elders leading the church, because that is the single New Testament model that we see. I've had people say, well, it just doesn't work. It's just not practical. And that is the struggle of that tiny hole. I'll tell you what, it would be much easier in our church if I was just given the title of senior pastor instead of having to serve on a team of elders together. It would be like slicing that hole open. It would happen so easily. I could lead a lot more easily than I can lead on the team, and yet it would deprive our church of a lot of our health. The struggle to come to consensus on issues would go away. The accountability that we have within our teams would go away. The entire burden of the church would rest on my shoulders alone, instead of being spread out amongst the elders. I can't tell you how many churches I know that they struggle. The burden sits on one man instead of being spread out amongst a team, where when one struggles, has difficulty with health or in their marriage, or something's happening, the other can step in to help. The protection can be removed from the elders at that point when you have one person. The giftedness of one person then becomes the giftedness of the church. Have you ever noticed that sometimes churches take on the personality of their senior pastor, their lead pastor, their strengths and their weaknesses? There's issues of downline, of secession plans. There are different levels of experience. In our church, I've got one of my co-pastors is in his upper 50s, another guy's in his mid-50s, another guy's in his 40s, I'm in my 30s, another guy's in his 20s. I think he's still in his 20s. And we have different levels of experience leading together. Now, if you look at all of that, you can find different ways to handle all those issues: the accountability, the burden, the protection, the giftedness, the experience, all of these things. You can find another way, but why? Why not just go back to the model that we see in the New Testament? Because it's there for us. It's clear. It's difficult. It's a struggle. It's painful, but it's the way God set up his church. Thanks for taking the time to listen. Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Noel Heikkinen, and I'm one of the pastors